Good day, brothers and sisters. This is the other Paul, and I am joined again with my friend Craig Truglia here. How are you today, Craig?
I'm good. To be honest, I didn't know we were starting with those letters. I don't know if we're going forward in time, backward in time. It was very confusing.
It's you just got to learn the superior Roman numeric system. It just makes me feel like I'm above people when I have my countdown in Roman numerals. I might even try to go above the Roman numeral people and do it in Attic numerals next. Who knows?
I don't even know what that is. I'm interested in that.
Very similar, pretty similar system. Not totally identical, but with Greek letters. So that'll be the fun time. So God willing, people will start pouring in now. We've got 4 people/3, whatever, coming in the moment, and that should grow over time. Especially because now this is my first stream where on StreamYard you're actually able to multicast to multiple different platforms. I only just discovered this recently. So I'm casting to YouTube right now, but also to my Facebook page and my Twitter page. So that is pretty flipping awesome. So hopefully, if we get other people on those pages, they'll get commenting as well. And so to introduce today's topic, it's actually a really long awaited one. We had this one planned since I first dropped my short Quartodeciman Controversy doco, and this was like mid last year or something. I should check the date of the video. It was many months ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so myself and Craig had this plan to, after the doco, we just look at the controversy together and we consider it from just shared perspectives on ecclesiology, also, so like our own perspectives as well, so Protestant perspective, Ortho perspective, but also in particular just its historical significance, implications, and all that jazz as well, and also taking a look at implications for Rome as well, so we can get the whole trifecta in there, see how everyone can evaluate it. So I didn't really have any big script for this setup because I'm pretty confident in what I know. Like I read this stuff, I made the doco, it's all pretty stuck in my mind. So I guess I can really just go anywhere. Maybe I'll ask you, Craig, where do you think is a good place to start?
Well, I think in short, I would say people that are interested in this controversy are generally interested in the issue of primacy. Does the
Yes,
Pope have
privacy.
primacy? Were there patriarchates or proto patriarchates? So immediately when people are interested in this, their minds are automatically going to certain Roman Catholic and Orthodox presuppositions, which isn't justified because that was all of Christendom until 500 years ago. But in some respects, also doesn't do justice to where even most scholarship, Protestant and Roman Catholic, is
Mm.
on the early ecclesiology. And so maybe it will help to unpack a little bit, at least those perspectives in a very surface level way. And
Yeah.
once I'll just say this: no matter who's right, by the late second century, what we have either already in place, if you're Orthodox or Roman Catholic, or coalescing, right? If you're taking the mainstream scholarly view that the mono-Episcopal organization church is something that developed really in the late first and mostly early second century and became solidified by the late second century. Whether view is correct is really immaterial because they're pretty much at the same spot once we hit the late second century. But understanding the possibilities of whether there was development or whether this was something that was established, the mono-episcopal system, really
Mm.
does affect how we analyze this controversy.
Yeah, I believe that by this point in time, monepiscopacy was quite well firmly established. Although exactly how those mono bishops, if you will, monoepiscopoi operated, I think it shows a very interesting transitory state between, let's say, the very early proto church, which I believe, as in the words you put it, was like a crypto Presbyterian church, versus going into the time of the councils where centralization was really, really solidified. I think the controversy of the late second century shows a very interesting stopgap in the evolution. Kind of like when you, whether you believe in evolution or not, it's kind of like you have the timeline of fossils going from one form into another. I believe we have something kind of like that with the Quartodeciman controversy, because on one hand, we do, I believe quite clearly, have monoepiscopoi, mono episcopacy and all that. But then on the other hand, we have an attitude and a, if you will, well, really an attitude and a structure of tolerance, if you say, for distinct practices along across the world, and on very practices which later on will not be tolerated, and unfortunately quite harshly. But then also, even with just how they solve these issues worldwide, they acknowledge that all the churches worldwide address this issue at the same time, but not in the manner of an ecumenical council, for example, but by means of a large number of local synods that came to their own decision. And the big significance alongside that is that when one regional synod, Asia Minor, decides to say, no, we're going to do this, even though everyone else does that, one boy up in Rome decides to kick up a stink in it, but then most, if we're to believe Eusebius, most or just about everyone else around him is like, no, that's their right. That's their right to go their own way. So, which I believe is a very, very stark contrast between, well, that attitude and that of the later ecumenical councils. That's how I kind of see the controversy.
Well, if people want anything recapped, obviously leave comments and we can interrupt and mill that. But it might help to start with the fact that what we all agree with, which is the church started by apostles, and the apostles ordained and appointed elders in their place. Now, elders is presbyters, and there's certain connotations depending upon your theological convictions of what exactly that means. So obviously you're Orthodox, this is bishops fulfilling a priestly function. If you're a Presbyterian, they're literally the presbyters of the church, ruling elders, right? And somewhere in between. I think it's worth pointing out that despite whichever those are true, what cannot be doubted is that obviously, even let's say Peter was a fellow elder, like it says in the letter of First Peter, obviously the apostle would have some better say in a situation.
He's still quite distinct. Yeah,
the apostle. That doesn't mean the apostles solely had recourse in isolation. In Acts chapter 15, the apostles and the elders had counsel, and this is something that's very important. Because the way the church functioned wasn't dictatorial. It functions, the Orthodox term, you always hear consensus, but let me speak a little more Protestantese because I'm on a Protestant channel. This is like brotherly fraternity, right? Like, we're brothers. We're the same family. We should all be on the same page of this family decision, right? This can't be taken lightly. So when you read 3 John, for example, like you could read the tone of the Apostle John, and it's almost like, what's this deal that like he would exclude us from communion? It's like this estranged family member.
Yeah.
And this very visceral reaction to acting outside of the family. So why is this way of thinking of the issue important? Because whether you're, like I'd say, taking the Presbyterian presupposition, or you're going to be taking the monoepiscopal presupposition, the point is, there was this motivation for unity. So when you fast forward to the late 2nd century and this question comes up, we're going to unpack how, in my opinion, this question came up. There is this deep-seated Christian motivation, which, again, the church at this point is less than 20 decades old. So what's that, 8 generations or so, something like that. So there's still deep-seated belief that we're a family, we must all come together and actually agree on it. This wasn't a matter of imperial policy, right? Like or Marcion or Justinian or whomever wanted to make sure everyone, because the fortunes of the empire would hinge upon this. I mean, whether you think that's important or not will depend upon, again, your theological persuasion. But all of us can agree that was not the motivation in 2nd century, because there was no sacralist institution, the church in the 2nd century. So the motivations really more what we see in scriptures, which is, the apostles, the elders, we're all family. We ought to all be together. We ought to be on the same team. Where there's differences we could tolerate, we'll tolerate them. Where there's differences we can't tolerate, we got to hammer it out in no uncertain terms, which the apostles did, obviously, like in Galatians chapter 2. So it's so important we have this biblical perspective, because that's actually far more relevant, in my opinion, than the context of the imperial church, which really starts happening in the mid to late 3rd century, when, let's say, with Paul Samosata, they're already asking for imperial intervention in church disputes, right? So you already start seeing the church having landed estates in the 3rd and 4th century, that they're becoming regional power players. Doesn't mean there's no power, no money whatsoever in the 3rd century. I'm going to argue there most certainly was. But what at least out of custom got them to all operate this way would have been very relevant to that sort of scriptural background. So maybe I'll there for a moment and give you an opportunity to comment.
Yeah, that's a really nice perspective. I like that, of looking at the church as the family, and that actually coheres with my own interpretation of the church's response to Victor, because how it's often portrayed by, let's say, the Catholic apologists, for example. And this isn't just going to be a Rome bashing session. We will get to that, but it's not all focused on that. But what you'll often see is where the Catholic apologists say, yes, Eusebius says that most of the bishops opposed Victor, but they never said that he didn't have the authority, just that it's not good to do this move for the sake of unity and all that. So they'll appeal to a very, very tenuous silence, I'd say, because only 2 of those sources are directly quoted, Irenaeus and Polycrates. And I'd argue that Polycrates actually does make that very argument at the very end of his letter, or of the quotation, where he says, I'm not scared by your threats because we must serve God rather than men. Which puts into question the idea of the Vicar of Christ, but if you will. And I think that explanation you gave there of the church as the big family rather than this imperially backed institution makes best sense of the church's response to Victor, because they weren't necessarily thinking in the categories of whether Victor had the authority or not to do this, but simply whether what he did at all was a good action at all, irrespective of the question of authority. It's like when I likened it to you, even with your family analogy, very similar, but I likened it before to like when you have a group of friends or whatever, and 2 of your friends have a spat, and then one of them comes out and just says, okay, this guy's out of the group. That's it. We're not hanging with him anymore. And that I think we can all probably think of a scenario or 2 like that in our friends groups. But then the response of the rest of the church would be like your other friends coming out saying, hey, bro, don't do that. What the heck are you doing this for? But in such discussions, and I've had discussions like this, the question of no one ever talks about whether that one friend has the authority to ice someone out of the group. That question doesn't come up. It's a matter of why the heck are you doing this? Why are you sowing discord and all that stuff? So just the lack of mention of authority doesn't mean that they thought he did have that authority and didn't question it, but rather best coheres with the perspective you kind of put it, where the church universal was considered of itself as a large family. And so Victor treated it in that way of saying, oh, this guy is going against the rest of the family, see you later. But then the rest of the family ends up saying, no, that's okay. That member's within his rights to do that. And then you can even go further with saying, well, we're talking about individual apostles and elders in one council versus a whole series of semi-independent churches, each of themselves having their own councils and thus being their own families by extension. So it's interesting to see how that dynamic would play of the individual family, their integrity, their unity, versus that with the rest of the church worldwide. So I do quite like that perspective. I think it's something worthy to discuss of whether in the deliberations of the Jerusalem Council, how much, if at all, there was the authority of those other elders appointed by the apostles in establishing it. Because then in the end, we do still see the distinction between those groups when it ends up being Peter and James, and particularly James, who come up with that final decision of, okay, this is what we're doing. So yeah, there'd still be that distinction, which I believe you recognize as well. But even then, there was collegiality and family in that institution.
And what we're seeing, I think, in the late 2nd century during the Easter controversy is perhaps frozen in time, a transition where, like I said, this more familial custom would have been adhered to, but at the same time, where due to practical considerations, and the reality is the church, even since the time of the apostles, was making notable, wealthy, powerful converts, like St. Luke talks about, the treasure of the town or whatever. In Paul's letters, they think about leaders of synagogues
Yep.
the bishops like Sosthenes and Corinth.
And even the treasure of Corinth with Paul.
Yeah, so you have, it's like Christianity isn't necessarily this just rabble, right? Like the Apostle John was known to the high priest. Well, how did that happen? Saint James was killed at the temple, and by, again, Josephus. You get this from historians that aren't Christians. Yeah, he was at the temple all the time and had intercourse, not sexual intercourse, obviously, had intercourse and discussions with the Jewish hierarchy. And so Christianity wasn't entirely on the fringes, even though in some respects they presented themselves as these unlettered, fishermen. But that wouldn't have been true of all of them, and not, for example, the Apostle Paul, who was obviously very notable in his time. And so that being said, though, it's important to see where this may be leading and where now our presuppositions sort of take over as where it could affect our analysis. And so when the apostles leave, we already see certain issues of dealing with intra-church and kind of lending itself to inter-church spats. And during those spats, we sort of see this paternalistic approach from bishops in notable sees. So, for example, in Corinth, we have in First Clement where at least the Church of Rome, because Clement's name is then saying, no, we asked Clement himself, but at least the Church of Rome was asked in some sort of appeal, would be the term, in Orthodox or in the Catholic discourse. If you're a Protestant, you might say, they just asked for help because it wasn't fair, or whatever words we want to cloak this with. There were some, the word appeal to Rome, to the elders at Rome. This is right. We're the elders here, and we didn't do anything wrong. Why are they deposing us? And then were given by, my opinion, is Clement in writing this letter on behalf of his church and synod. Again, I'm Orthodox, so he'd be on behalf of a whole synod. But you could take this crypto-Presbyterian view and say, all right, well, he's a bishop speaking for the other bishops. Whatever word you want to for that. The answer he gives, well, you can't just depose people that are appointed by the apostles or appointed by people appointed by the apostles. Well, why is this important? Well, this is important because if you think of, let's say, the regulative principle, that's the only example we have. And so this would have been theoretical to someone writing in the late 60s or early 70s AD when Clement would have wrote. He would have been writing this 5 to 10 years after St. Paul wrote to Titus about appointing elders in Crete, right? So they would have, and this is how the apostles operated, right? It's for Corinth now to operate outside of what everyone knew in very recent memories, how everything worked, was obviously very offensive. And so this could work for and against, let's say, Protestant presuppositions. And let me make an argument in favor for the Protestant case. Again, the crypto-Presbyterian would be this. Why would the church in Corinth take it upon themselves to so willy-nilly depose their elders if this mono-episcopal view was so firmly entrenched and well understood? And it would almost to a liberal scholar, and I don't mean liberal pejorative, mainstream scholar probably be a better term, would be that in mainstream scholarship, the view would be, well, it's because there was no mono-episcopal presumption. They didn't know they can't just go do that. And so they just don't know because no one wrote down, you can't do this. It kind of really required Clement saying, well, the reason we don't do this because the apostles didn't do this, and the reason they must have not done this is because Christ appointed the apostles. They must be following Christ's example, right? And so that could very much work in favor of Protestant presuppositions. But again, that's not the topic of this video. Why is this important? We see appeals, again, kind of a loaded term, but appeals being made to Rome. We now see, if we go a few decades later, with St. Ignatius of Antioch. Now, Antioch probably actually was the third largest city in the Roman Empire, depending on which scholar, could have been the second largest, whatever. Point is, very rich, very powerful, influential city in its time. Okay? And he's making his rounds, his victory lap, his martyric victory lap throughout the Roman Empire. And in so doing, he's being kind of, sticking his nose in a lot of people's business. Let's be honest. He's sticking his nose in a lot of people's business. And so when he's sticking his nose in business, he's putting forward a very specific view of the episcopacy. One, as again, where the Orthodox hat right now, makes it very difficult to explain that the monoepiscopacy was something that was radical or invented by him, as some scholarships claim, that he takes it so much for granted that he could just say this and people aren't going to revolt from this. And I think maybe the one thing both sides could agree on, whether it's traditional Roman Catholic Orthodox monoepiscopal types and the mainstream scholars, would be that for what it's worth, what he was dictating and saying is the case would have at least been something that would have made some sort of sense to people that heard it. That being, would have had elders that rose to the top, so to say, as you said, chairman of the board. And so, yes, you can't go against the chairman of the board. Well, we're not the Soviet Union where we don't have a conductor and orchestra and everyone plays in a circle, right? So, like, the yes, you must go by the conductor would have not been this very alien idea. And us not speaking Koine Greek at the time, so the bishop and then kind of making this dichotomy between him and the presbyters might have not come off so strange if they would have understood what he was getting at. Because mainstream scholarship argues, though I disagree, that even when St. Ignatius was writing this, that Rome, until maybe the mid-second century, still had this plural episcopacy, and they based this off of reading the Shepherd of Hermas. And so the fact that Ignatius is writing this when, according to mainstream scholarship, there wasn't even an established monoepiscopacy in Rome itself. Again, I hear this, but again, we got to give a fair hearing to the scholarly view. Shows what he said could have been so alien that it would have not resonated some way. So even if there's a episcopacy in Rome itself, that doesn't mean there would have not been a chairman of the board, so to say. Now, the theory, before now, we're going to connect this, because I'm going to give you an opportunity to interject, because it's your show. But
Exactly. It's your bloody show right now. What the heck, bro?
Well, before we connect this to the actual Easter controversy, I think it's worth saying this. This is the sort of harmony I've attempted to make sense of the crypto-Presbyterian and the mono-Episcopal views, which is, if we look at ancient church canons, and Paul and I disagree on this, there's this this office called the core bishop or a country bishop. They're essentially, if you're Orthodox or Catholics, they're pretty much abbots with the title of bishop. They could ordain minor orders, and with the permission of a higher bishop, could partake in other ordinations, but otherwise they can. And people go, well, that sounds crazy. But one, it's not, because they actually existed. There's canons on them. And two, like in the West, I don't know if it's actually theoretically canon law in the Roman Catholic Church today, but for centuries, technically the bishop gave absolution from confession, not the priest. The priest can only give absolution by the bishop's, permission, very much. Like, you could act as my proxy, but otherwise it's my prerogative, not yours, priest. So that view also applied to ordinations. The core bishop could essentially do these things, but only if he's given permission, so to say, according to the canons, of the actual, let's say, archbishops or metropolitans of the area. And so this kind of makes a lot of sense when you read, the early conciliar documents, just how many bishops they had. Like in the Donatist controversy, you're talking 500 easy, and just like in rural areas in Africa. And so that being said, there were a lot of country bishops. And why is this kind of important here? Well, it's important here because if we were to presume, yes, there's a monoepiscopacy, but this plural episcopacy that people perceive were just these bishops with limited powers that were pretty much glorified priests, then that kind of could help us harmonize our views when they talk of many bishops, because they don't talk about all the people ordaining. Now, there's a lot of presumptions there, but at least can help harmonize the views, which is why I take this view. Now, the point of this episode is not to actually argue this, but here's whether it developed into that or it was always that. By the late second century, rather, when the Easter controversy occurs, what you pretty much have are bishops that are very much falling. They have synods or organizations, or let's say they're the family that lives on this block, and the other family lives across the town, right? If you were all parents and everyone in the extended family moved to the same part of Australia, or however your family got there.
Classic Lebanese family.
right? They're all driving distance to one another. If this were 1920, they'd all be walking distance. So anyway, however, they're organizing around regional heads. And this leads to a consolidation of power, a consolidation of money. And when there's persecution, and the only way to solve issues is by dealing with things locally and then writing to your family members far away, this is what we decided. This creates sort of political context where the Easter controversy arose. So I'll stop there and I'll let you interject.
Yes. Thank you very much, Craig. To remind viewers, this is indeed a show on the Other Paul's channel, not on Orthodox Christian theology. And I'll look at a couple of initial comments first. Interesting to see the Orthochog perspective.
I don't even know what that is.
So in your debate, when Christian Wagner just came on to moderate, you said in one of your statements, either your closing or cross exam, you briefly said Orthochog and then Orthodox. So I corrected it.
Remember that? Okay.
And that's just become an inside joke now. Like I didn't even make anything of it, but now it's just a thing. And now, Karis, good question, Karis. What is Craig doing with that Eutychian? I
don't get
it. Okay, I said in a recent video.
I'm guessing you're the Eutychian.
The meme, yes. I said in a meme. I said in a recent video because it wasn't scripted. I said the nature of Christ, singular. And I made a meme video out of it, just self-mocking, and now that's a thing because I edited my name in that video and to say the other Eutyches. But yes, to briefly respond to that, because thank you for giving the tangent on monepiscopacy, core bishops, and all that, because that's like those are entire other streams themselves, really. And I'd say with myself that those developments, like with Jerome, for example, when he talks about that monepiscopacy, developed like it actually developing from an original plural episcopacy, that ultimately these develops are, well, at least as far as I'm aware, they're solid, they're perfectly legitimate developments. Because I don't believe, with the prop perspective, I believe that God, the apostles, they established a very basic core structure for how the church ought to be. But beyond that, the churches and all that, they're free to develop in their own way. And that's really, in my opinion, how the church ended up doing it, where or the various churches ended up doing it, where they would get very particular structures to develop over time in response to practical necessity. So like, for example, when Jerome said that in response to heresy, that's when the monepiscopacy came up, presumably, I believe, so as to centralize authority so people don't just go out and start doing their own things unwarranted and all that. And likewise with core bishops and all that stuff, all great practical things. And then even into the Quartodeciman Controversy, where I think we end up seeing the quite proto-development of patriarchs. So we see with the various synods, for example, it's discussed how Eusebius talks about, for example, how Irenaeus presided over the bishops at Gaul in that synod. So Irenaeus was, if you will, the late 2nd century patriarch of Gaul. And likewise with, of course, Victor in Rome, and with Polycrates in Asia Minor, because he specifically talks about how, at the request of Victor, he gathered all the bishops into the synod, and he's basically giving that representative response back to Victor, saying, "Yeah, stuff you, we're doing our own thing." So we see all these very practical developments happening at the start of at this time. And it's like it's like in that sequence again of the fossil chain, where you see a fossil from one creature and then develops going all the way into another. And I basically believe that this controversy gives us a fascinating look at that middle step of that development. And then with the likes of Ignatius, for example, with looking at the monepiscopacy, my own theory is that with how adamant he is with the monepiscopacy in his teaching, and yet that would kind of go a bit awkward with the view that at that time Rome had a plural episcopacy. My own view would be that if that evidence does par out from, for example, the Shepherd of Hermas, if that really does demonstrate that the plural episcopacy extended in Rome into that period, which for me would make sense, because, well, originally a plural episcopacy in Rome is really the only thing that does make sense, because Rome is so bloody big, and already by the time of Paul had a pretty thriving Christian community of Gentiles and Jews. So it only makes it's really the only practical sense that there would be multiple so bishops, so to speak, in Rome. So perhaps their individual diocese, if you will, was more like the diocese of the Jewish quarter and the diocese of the Gentile quarter, and so on and so forth. And so with me, my own way I think of it is that perhaps Ignatius simply did not know yet the exact structure of Rome. If that was the case, that there was a plural episcopacy in Rome at the time of Ignatius, and yet he's very adamant on monoepiscopacy, he may simply just have not known at that time the structure of Rome. In which case, when he does finally arrive there and see, oh, there's multiple bishops here, then he might think back to his letters and like, oh crap, well that's kind of awkward. Someone send him some revisions, please, which would be a bit bizarre, maybe disconcerting to some people. Although that's a kind of a possibility I raise if the Shepherd of Hermas does demonstrate a plural episcopacy, which I've seen some pushback to that. So either way, I'm fine with that. But yeah, that's more or less my attitude with the whole controversy, that we do see the developments and the ecclesiological implications, I believe in myself, and I don't want to go the full, of course, apologetic here, although of course I'll give my perspective with it. What I believe it shows is that there was a series of evolution towards the idea of the ecumenical councils, for example, which I believe, and I just recently got this very timely. This just arrived for me, Nicaea and its Legacy by Louis Ayres. Really, really cool, and it looks at some of that history between Nicaea and Constantinople, of including various councils in between them, which I believe demonstrated that. And I think I've talked with you, and I think you've agreed with this, that the idea of the ecumenical council as a truly magisterial and divine and infallible institution ended up developing with time. And with my own perspective, at least, I'd say, well, you can qualify that if you want.
As a right off the bat, actually, they were arguing Constantine has a letter where he states that God must be speaking through so many bishops, which I interpret as consensus. So there was this sort of view of what could happen when the whole family agreed on something.
I think that's a possible view, although I think another one which many people don't consider, because there's many such statements in the Fathers, for example, of God spoke through the bishops, or spoke through this person, or spoke through that, or like, for example, Peter spoke through Leo, and all that jazz. I think people, because the dialectic is all immediately on authority, that's really the only thing people think about. But I think another very plausible way to read that is simply that, because they could say that, why we need to ask the question why they say that. They may be saying that, because when all the bishops are gathered, the Holy Spirit is there, and what they put together in a creed, that's definitely guided by the Holy Spirit, it's infallible, all that jazz. Or it may be that, well, they wouldn't say it in as many words, but, well, I believe that X is the truth, and these guys are saying that same truth, and so I believe that the Holy Spirit really is working with them, which is very common parlance today. We would say that, particularly us Pentecostals, we'd say, the Holy Spirit really taught through that preacher today, because we're presuming that what that teacher said is right, which doesn't mean that we believe that they have a de jure infallibility in certain circumstances. So I think that's a way to read that with respect to Constantine and the bishops in the council, combined with the fact that it's very grand council, so-called all across the world, the bishops, even though there was many more bishops who didn't attend, which I think is another fascinating issue to address with respect to so-called ecumenical councils, in my opinion. But I'd say, with my prod opinion, to give my brief prod apologetic, I'd say that given the lack of a direct public revelation establishing this authority, like we have throughout Scripture, with God establishing directly, for example, a Davidic monarchy, the authority of the apostles, all that stuff, without anything short of that, I believe would not establish and could not establish something that could be considered infallibly guided by the Holy Spirit. That'd be my prod apologetic, and it's not the most relevant thing. And to kind of tie it with this, I'd say the Quartodeciman Controversy demonstrates that, where the attitude shifts between the time of the apostles and then going to the ecumenical councils from one of collegiality, one of, hey, look, this church has their own way of doing things. It's perfectly fine as long as they keep the core faith itself, all the way to one of, look, we're gonna get together, us number of bishops, and we're gonna, in my own perspective, tyrannize the other bishops into doing this same thing. That'd be my take of it. And because, of course, I gave my prod apologetic, you're free to give your ortho apologetic.
what we see is let's just call it pre-conciliar, and I think what we see in the Eastern controversy is our pre-conciliar consensus, and so they're trying to do what we see in Acts 15 with the capacity to really get everyone in one spot because of persecutions and money, and now far larger distances than we're dealing with in Acts chapter 15. But we also see this in Acts of the Apostle. When St. Paul is in Rome in the last chapter, the synagogue there said, "We haven't received a letter from with instructions saying anything about you." Now, clearly, they had to know something about Christianity because we know from Acts chapter 18 that all the Christians and Jews were kicked out of Rome. So it's not like they knew nothing about the sect. They were being a little coy, I believe. But what's this deal with the letter? Now, I know this just from like a cursory study of Jewish history, is there was a Sanhedrin of 70 priests or so in Jerusalem. Actually, it was exactly 70. And there were local Sanhedrins that went from like as high as 70, they'd stick with the number, and went as low as like 23. And they wanted that so like you could actually have the vote go more than one side than the other. They would essentially come to local decisions and then letters of recommendation saying this is where we're at, or this is what we think of this person, and you're expected to follow. And you actually see vestiges of this in early Christianity, presuming this is how you do things, because St. Paul says, "Oh, we don't have letters, but you are a letter," in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Well, what's he referring to? He's referring to the term in church history we call letters commendatory. But really, this comes from the Sanhedrin system. It's just it's a continuation of how Judaism operated outside of just Israel. This gets to all sort of the directions, or like, did people notice St. Paul looked like he was connected to the Jerusalem Sanhedrin? Is why the synagogue was given an opportunity to speak, like we see in Acts chapter 13, etc. But let's get to this Easter controversy. We're 40 minutes in. So the point is, the church now has a disagreement. Custom, like we talked about, has been customarily the family must have agreement on things. It's bizarre for the family to be broken apart anyway. You can't just go to the other family member's house and you're not on the same page with this. So there's that mentality, and then there's the mentality of, well, we solve this by coming to local decisions when we have to, if we can't all get together, and then we can't just call someone up. There's no phones back then. You mail letters, so to say. These letters commendatory, though that's usually for individuals, but you get the point. And so when all of the different localities in this Easter controversy try to hash this out, I'm going to start unpacking this. There's actually kind of two controversies. There's Easter, and then there's Pope Victor and what he was trying to do. And there were actually two separate controversies solved the exact same way. All right, well, let's talk about how this works, unless you really feel the need to interject now.
I'll briefly kind of interject on something you're talking about commendatory letters, where it's kind of like there's distinct synods, but they functionally end up acting like one because they have these different letters coming together. Is that how you said it, or did I horribly misread you?
Establish consensus via correspondence.
Yeah, got you. So with that, I'd and I'm sorry, there's that, but then there's also the that there was a controversy there was a disagreement within the church, and they were trying to solve that and all that. Partially, I'd say yes. But on the other partial thing, I'd say nah, because when it comes to the decisions, when all the local synods around make their decision, and one of them's out of step, and that's all the precipitation you need. You have one region versus a dozen others, including the likes of Rome, for example, and Irenaeus and Gaul and all that stuff. They're in their perfect position to say, "Oi, you're going against the consensus, bruh. Come back in line. Let's make unity. Let's stop the disagreement." But then instead, they simply turn around and say, "No, that's okay. They can do their own thing." So, in one way, you can talk of it as one controversy, but I think in another way, it's more so localized controversies. Like the whole thing of when to celebrate Easter ends up coming to the consciousness of the church at the Church Universal at roughly similar times, but they end up treating it as an in-house thing within their individual regions. and so when one region decides to do something that the rest of them aren't, the other ones, except for Rome, of course, or Victor in particular, God knows what his other bishops were saying. The other ones just aren't really fussed because they're ultimately treating it as an in-house thing within their own regions, which does itself demonstrate still that there is more centralization than one might have seen in the very earliest decades of the church, for example, where now you have regions being able to decide things for everybody within that region, for example, in a regional synod. But nonetheless, it demonstrates to me that there's less of an Easter controversy and more Easter controversies. And the response of Victor, in my opinion, is what ends up making it a singular controversy, because he decided to step out of his lane, so to speak, and go to another church and start to kick up a stink. What would you take on that?
I'm going to blow up everyone's narrative. So get
Oh, no, that's what I think it is.
So that being said, my opinion, please watch the other Paul's 20-minute documentary on the Easter controversy. It's very neutral. It's pretty much just the facts. It even has the Greek in front of you if you want to see it. And you make an interesting comment, which isn't out of ignorance. It's out of what most people would say looking at the same sources, which is for some reason, we don't know why, all of a sudden people got all angry over Ephesus custom. And I'm going to make a different argument. I'm going to argue Ephesus started making a stink out of their own custom as a power play. All right. Now that I said that, let's start making the case. We have to get the meme out of our heads that the early church was pristine. They would never do such a thing, right? But you see that in the Bible. So if the apostles are dealing with that, if St. Paul's a little suspicious of what James is up to, if James is putting Paul in his place when he's in Jerusalem, you're going to get some of these power dynamics. I mean, local church, people pull rank in church. So the apostles pull rank, and of course, but because even Protestants, there's this sort of, like I said, I call it a meme, but scholars are even they're inundated with this, is that somehow the earliest church is ultra pristine. There's no one doing anything selfish. And so we have to kind of look at these early controversies in a very rudimentary, they're almost arguing like little kids. They're not doing anything profound or self-serving. And I just think that's incredibly, I don't think we would apply that sort of standard to any other topic of history. So my opinion, I'm going to argue, is that Ephesus was making a power play. Why? Well, let's look at the history of Ephesus. Some scholarship claims that Ephesus in the 2nd century AD was the second largest city on earth. Now, I don't think that's true. They might have been 4th largest in the Roman Empire, likely behind Alexandria and Antioch. But the point being is they were a very important city at the end of the Silk Road. That's pretty much where the Silk Road ended. And in that time, they didn't have a silted over port. So that's where you got all the junket boats. And throughout the Roman Empire was in Ephesus. So this obviously made them incredibly important. We even see in Acts chapter 20, Ephesus is really this sort of hub, right? Paul speaks to a multitude of bishops when he's in Ephesus. If you're Protestant, because he believes in plural episcopacy, but Orthodox Roman Catholic, it's because clearly Ephesus had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in that or in the surrounding areas, and they would have needed a lot of different leaders for their church. So when we look at just how powerful and rich Ephesus was, we have to see that Ephesus was considerably humbled in the mid-3rd century when I think it was the Goths sacked Ephesus, and they never quite made it back after that. The city was pretty much ransacked and destroyed, and it still existed, but it just never quite made it back. And see, the next few centuries of church history is a continual humbling of Ephesus. So whether it's, let's say, Constantinople I, where it took what was Ephesus' jurisdiction, or fast forwarding a little bit, their jurisdiction was over Asia Minor. It was transferred to Constantinople. Well, that's a real slight to Ephesus, where they were called the Metropolitan of Asia. That was their title. There's a reason why that the Bishop of Constantinople eventually, well, I need a better title than that, Ecumenical Patriarch. That's why I'm above the Metropolitan of Asia, And so for that reason, we see that Ephesus, in the Council of Ephesus I, Council of Ephesus II, Council of Ephesus III, big surprise, each time reasserted their authority over Constantinople and were re-granted sense of autonomy, which is now what we call autocephaly. But the point is autonomy and power over the region. And so it appears to me that Ephesus was making something of a custom. The question's why. And this is where we got to actually read Polycrates' letter very carefully. Ephesus, what do you think that who the apostle was? Peter's from Rome, and in Antioch, and that made Antioch a little more important. Whether or not that was an apostolic concept or not, I think what both sides could agree is this became something that was important by the late 2nd century for whether it's a charism or whether it's just the precedent is so important you can't go against it. So you see, like St. Irenaeus, well, Peter and Paul died in Rome, so no one dare, object to the authority and teaching of the Church of Rome, and anywhere with these other apostles. And so we see that these churches start saying, yeah, well, I'm the church of Peter and Paul, and I'm the church of Antioch. Well, I'm also the church of Peter and Paul, Jerusalem, well, or Alia at this time. Well, we're theoretically the church of Jesus, right? So everyone can make these claims. Well, what's the claim of Ephesus? Who started Ephesus church? Well, Paul did, right? And so, well, Paul started Ephesus church and Paul died in Rome. Doesn't that kind of put them in the boat maybe of Corinth and these other churches started by Paul, that maybe they're second fiddle to Rome? So it appears to me, I'm going to argue, that Ephesus was pushing a counter narrative. We are not the church of Paul, which makes no sense. St. Paul started this church. There's no one disagrees about that. But if you read Polycrates' letter, he says, we had many apostles here, including Philip and John in his later years. Why did he leave out Paul? Right? And so people read this and they're saying, oh, he's naming apostles to look impressive. Well, wouldn't it be impressive if he added Paul? Well, not if the reason was that he was naming the other apostles to show that they're independent of Rome. Right? Rome was saying, we're the bishopric of Peter and Paul. That means everyone Paul started has to at least get our agreement with stuff, because you're part of our family, and we're the elder of this family. Well, Ephesus is saying, and I would argue Smyrna, Sardis, those churches which were really part of the same orbit, because Polycarp was of Smyrna, for example, which is maybe the 5th largest city of the Roman Empire at the time. They're not coincidentally from very powerful, rich cities, by the way, guys. Got to keep that in mind. So, I say, no, John died here. His relatives are here. It kind of resets. Now they're no longer under Paul's thumb, so to say, or Rome, right? We're so used to saying Rome is Peter. We forget that the original party line was Rome is Peter and Paul. That was the original party line.
Yep.
That's what St. Stephen in the
Checkmate papers.
Well, it's true, and you get this in like Galasius. You get this in way later popes than that, by the way. I'd argue you get this to Pope Adrian into the late 8th century, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, Rome's already saying we're the elder church of the PATRON and Pauline churches, right? So we need to all come into line under our authority. And Ephesus, who's not really a minor city in the Roman Empire, is saying, well, no, we don't have to. Well, what's the theological justification for that? Because John died here. So, right, he kind of takes over now that Paul is gone. And that's incredibly important. And I don't think coincidental that Paul's left out of Polycrates' letter. So here's where I'm going with this. Whether St. Irenaeus kind of innocently says this aberrant, if you say it's wrong to have it on the 14th, or this different custom on the 14th, St. Irenaeus credits it to simplicity. This very they were just silly, dumb people, and they just kept things going the way it was, and they got confused, and now it's on the 14th there, and it's been like that for a long time because they were silly and confused from years ago. And with like I said, the sort of money involved, the apostles involved, that explanation is not very historically compelling. I think it's a very nice explanation that helps people save face per se. It's very charitable, and maybe it's correct. It's not defying the laws of physics or anything like that. But that being said, it's it kind of makes sense whether this difference was made intentionally as a way of separating themselves, or it was some sort of local aberrant custom, or this legitimate different custom, however you want to put it, that was then emphasized in order to show Ephesus' independence and difference from Rome and from the Pauline Petrine fold. And that's what I think is the context that you never hear people talk about, which makes sense if you read Polycrates' letter, and it makes sense if you understand the geopolitical and economic situation of the Near East at this time. So now that I've blown people's mind, before I unpack anything else, I'll let you or the audience interject about whatever.
I think you need to give this a name, like the Ephesian conspiracy or something, because it's elaborate, it's fascinating, and it's not totally without warrant, because we don't have the exact motivations, we don't have the written motivations or whatever for why Victor interjected with Ephesus, for example, because it's immediately assumed, both by the Roman apologists and those who argue against them, that it was Victor trying to assert universal authority over the entire church, which would thus assume.
I'll interrupt one comment. The initial response was from the world's churches just over Ephesus' custom, right? Go, well, what motivated them? Well, something came up about their custom, and in all their responses, something in Victor's response now offended everyone to respond against him. So it looks like Ephesus started a fight. Victor, in responding to this, said something, now started another fight. And that's what's often left out in this. All right, I'm done interrupting.
Bloody hell! I'm liking the other Craig show. Far out. I feel inadequate now. Okay, I'm gonna take over. I'm gonna take over this. I'm gonna take your theory to the woodshed now. It's only fair. So with that, it's a reasonable interpretation, because, as I said, we don't have the exact motivations for Victor. It's assumed that he is just asserting his authority of the entire church, which would thus assume that if a different church that wasn't started by Peter or Paul, let's say Ethiopia, if that church was there and if they did that, then he would assert his authority over them, whatever. But you're saying that he particularly asserted his authority over Ephesus when they dissented, because they're from the same quote unquote family, so to speak, because they're from the same traditional line of Peter and Paul. And well, that doesn't even require per se the view of authority, but going back to the family view and friends view that I brought up, where they're simply observing that Ephesus, in their opinion, is going against the shared tradition of Paul, and so they believe that by that fact alone, not necessarily by their authority, that Ephesus is just out of the universal church. Now, one other thing I believe may give your theory a little bit of credit, a little bit more credit, is the witness of either Socrates, Scholasticus, or the other secondary source, who basically just copy what Eusebius said. Sorry?
Is it Sozomen?
Yes, Sozomen, that's it. So either Socrates or Sozomen specifies that the tradition, because they both basically just copy paste Eusebius, which really shows us just how fundamental Eusebius is to our historical understanding. Without him, we'd probably know nothing about that 2nd century specific controversy. But he specifies in his section, one of them, Socrates or Sozomen, on this controversy, that the tradition of celebrating the Paschal feast after the vernal equinox was something passed down by Peter and Paul. He specifically puts that as something in his text, which would thus show that, at least at his time, that it was considered important that this wasn't merely just an apostolic tradition, but that it was by Peter and Paul in particular. And so if that was the mindset of Victor, if that mindset went back to Victor, then you could possibly posit that Peter had that in mind, that, hey, this is Paul's tradition and that was started by Paul. Why the heck are they rejecting that? So I think that's very much possible. Where I diverge from it,
I'm of Paul, I'm of Christ, I'm of Apollo.
Well, yeah, that's it. It may well simply be something like that. And what up, Canadian Catholic? Good to see you here, mate. But I think one thing that makes me diverge from it is that in the end, I think this does require a little bit of a multiplication of variables, to use the Occam's razor language. Like, not that it's contradicted per se. It does require an assumption or two. and then of course to bring out the closet rationalist within me, the simplest explanation is simply that Victor just did not like Ephesus was doing that in and of itself. But I think with the response of Ephesus through Polycrates, them giving their pushback against Victor, what it seems like was that their problem wasn't, they don't really betray, at least in what Eusebius preserves, which he preserves quite a bit of the letter. They don't really betray a concern of going with this guy's tradition versus of going with this tradition over that of Paul and that, for example, because what Polycrates does is he records a ton of figures, including what he believes are two apostles, John, of course, and then Philip, which there's controversy over whether he mistook Philip the evangelist, one of the 7 deacons, for Philip of the 12 apostles. So that's a different kettle of fish there. But either way, he believed that 2 apostles asserted this, whatever, and so it's a legitimate opinion. I don't think from that response what he's doing is pitting one apostle against another, but simply that this practice does come from some apostle, and this is something we did, and it coheres with the response of Irenaeus himself, where he refers to an account of Polycarp with Anicetus of Rome, where they both have these differing opinions, and yet they decide to go apart in peace. And so, let me get back my train of thought because I just lost it suddenly. And so,
I can interrupt you with my own train of thought.
Yeah, please interrupt while I get my thoughts back.
So that being said, like I said, it's the old habits die hard when we take this sort of pristine view of early church history, because when we read about these theological disputes in the 9th century and enzymes or this and the other thing, these are just covers for political stuff, right?
Sorry, may I counter-interrupt? May I counter-interrupt before I lose the thought again, because I just got it back. What Polycrates is doing, he's asserting basically a whole line of historical witnesses of people who followed this tradition. And so, with respect to the aspect of your theory, if I'm not mistaken, that you believe that Ephesus kind of made a switch, that this actually was an original practice, but then they tried to justify something new. Is that your theory, or do you believe they actually practiced that at the beginning?
Paul's name deliberately to show their apostolic pedigree wasn't contingent upon him.
Okay. Yeah. Possible reading. Although, and if I remember you talking about the theory before, if I remember you correctly, did you imply that? I'm sorry if you answered this already. Did you imply that the Quartodeciman position was actually something that came up later, but then they just kind of dropped some names to kind of justify it?
Well, it would have existed before Polycarp, or at least he was part of its creation or the confusion surrounding it, or who knows. Because even St. Irenaeus says it was based upon confusion, but it's one of those differences that even if it was a legitimate early difference, let's say it really came from John, as they all recollect, sometimes you make something of a difference on purpose because it meets some sort of end. And that's why the councils, if we go by Eusebius, the councils were held against Ephesus' custom. And it was because Ephesus asserted itself and refused to relent, right? Like they wouldn't relent. They weren't going to change their custom. So why was this something like how did we make such a big point out of?
Yeah.
And it was Victor's addressing of their refusal that then created the second controversy.
Okay, yeah. So interesting. Where does Irenaeus say that this was simply a confusion on the part of Asia Minor? Is this in Eusebius's account, or?
Yeah, it is. Yep, it's in his account. He just says that pretty much he calls them simple and the custom started early. He calls it ancient. It's a very relative term. But we're getting it on screen now.
We're getting it on screen, baby. I'm say that again. You kind of blocked out. Did you say something? Because you kind of. Oh no! Craig's frozen. Ladies and gentlemen, Craig is frozen. Where hath he gone? Well, I guess.
I mean, just to continue spelling off. I'm back.
Okay, you're back. Good. Woo. Or is he? Yes, he's back. So let's go through it a little bit, because Among blah, 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 blah. Because I'd like to, because I remember I did read that bit, but I don't remember him calling it like something like simple, like a confusion that they made. Only that it's comparable to many other differences in practice around Easter that they otherwise tolerate. Although he does in that letter, according to Eusebius, prefer, of course, the traditional position of the rest of the churches. Among these are presbyters before Soter, who presided over the church which now rule. They neither observed it themselves nor permitted those after them, and yet not observing it, they were nonetheless at peace with those who came from and passages in which was observed, although this observance was more opposed to those who did not observe it. But none were ever cast out before you who did not observe it, sent the Eucharist, peacemaker. But those matters were in shape, they communed together. Observe. For neither could Anicetus persuade Polycarp not to observe what he had always observed with John, the disciple of the Lord. So it actually appears the opposite. It actually appears that Irenaeus assumes that Polycarp.
Well, no, wait. I have Eusebius' church history. 1 second.
Okay.
Part 2.
Other Paul is a verified fact checker. Don't slander me with that title, thank you. I'm a truth enjoyer. Just call me that. I'm a truth enjoyer. I'm not a fact checker. But so what it looks like here, it appears to me the opposite. It appears that Irenaeus assumes that Polycarp did actually observe this with John the Apostle. And so for that aspect of your theory, that it was perhaps based on a confusion, Ephesus ended up taking it up so that they could assert their independence from the likes of Rome and all that stuff. I think that's kind of put into question with what appears to be a very airtight historical pedigree, because we have Irenaeus and Polycrates independently attesting to Polycarp and John following this line of tradition. But it may be possible in a light. Sorry, say that again.
I said I disagree. I disagree with that. When maybe during question and answers, I could find it, because I have the chapter right here in this, Microsoft Word version all printed out. So I'll get more information on it in a bit. But let me talk about a little more about Ephesus situation. Polycrates in his letter said he's the 8th of 7 other people in his own family that are bishops in Ephesus.
Yep.
And so this obviously implies a considerable consolidation of power within Ephesus itself, within a family line, just like Saint Cyril of Alexandria. I have a kid interrupting. It's like that guy in Hong Kong. Kids ran in the middle of the interview. So that being said, where was I going with this? So we know that Polycrates was consolidating power, just like the Cyril of Alexandria and Theophilus of Alexandria. They had a bit of they had a lot of family power within Alexandria, and you even see relatives of Cyril complaining in the Council of Chalcedon. So why is this relevant? It's relevant because when you have a family that has a lot of power, a lot of money invested in this, it motivates some of these assertive behaviors politically, because we see this later in church history. This is not something that is totally out of nowhere. Now, that being said, when Victor responded, his response wasn't offensive because he disagreed with the tradition in Ephesus specifically, because everyone disagreed with the tradition in Ephesus. My theory is Ephesus made an issue of that tradition. Rather, to quote Eusebius, he says that Victor attempted to cut off Ephesus. And attempted means he couldn't, right? It's and all Asia. So, right, this is not just Ephesus, but this includes Smyrna, Sardis. This would include Asia Minor. And so these letters sharply rebuking Victor, and again, those are quotations from Eusebius, were on the issue of why he couldn't. And so the fact that Eusebius, in looking at this controversy, says Victor tried doing this, and we know it's not he backed off. He writes down that Victor wrote letters of excommunication. So he actually went ahead and did it.
Yeah.
But this is viewed as insufficient according to Eusebius, because that's not how the church works. this, of course, that offends Roman Catholic sensibilities. At least, again, the trads wouldn't, moderates and liberals and people that read scholarship.
Just slap some Newman on it and call it a day.
Yeah, it's not going to offend people with mainstream views. But the fact of the matter is, Eusebius obviously views this is not a prerogative of the Bishop of Rome, because he went ahead and did it, and it fell upon deaf ears. It was something he attempted to do and it didn't work. So Irenaeus, we know that the responses to Victor were on the synodical level, and Irenaeus wrote on behalf of the Gaulish Synod. So he wrote on behalf of the Synod of Gaul. Again, we're talking beforehand that synod is somewhat loaded term, but at least the churches of Gaul, and he was like the elder one there, and people were going to let him talk for them. Well, however, Protestant presupposition or Orthodox, whatever you want to use, point is, Irenaeus is speaking for the churches in France. All right. Mm-hmm. His argument pretty much is this is disciplinary. People have different disciplines. It's no big deal. And he wrote this letter, according to Eusebius, to all the churches in the world. So this was meant as a way of correcting Pope Victor. So this wasn't him politely speaking him off the ledge or whatever. This was a very public rebuke of St. Pope Victor. And again, the reason why is the precedent of what Pope St. Victor was doing would have subjugated Ephesus. And we know this did not occur because really for the next 3 centuries of Ephesus history is friction of Ephesus having autonomy. So they already now have autonomy after this controversy. What Pope St. Victor didn't subjugate them. They actually had full-blown autonomy and them losing it over time due to imperial policy after the Council, right? Okay. Probably subjugation to Nicomedia, then to Constantinople, canonically so, Constantinople I, and then the vestiges of Ephesus, they're in their death throes, asserting their more ancient prerogatives, dissipating over time over the councils, Ephesus 1, 2, 3. Mm. And so this is so important to understand because it's bizarre when a Roman Catholic, now this is me wearing the Orthodox apologist hat, it's bizarre when the Roman Catholic apologists list this episode as some sort of proof that the papacy is this legitimate apostolic constitution, because the person writing the story is even like the echoes of such a view to be ridiculous, right? This is something that the Bishop of Rome cannot do.
Yep.
Irenaeus, if I were to use more colorful language, blank slaps Pope St. Victor by writing the whole world that he's wrong, sharply rebuking him. And we know from Eusebius, Irenaeus wasn't the only one who did this. So Rome was pretty much humbled and put in their place by this episode. So it's a very peculiar text or episode to list in one's support, because all we really see is Rome, in my opinion, making a legitimate claim. You're a Pauline church, and we know Peter and Paul died here, and all the other Pauline churches and Petrine churches follow this. So if you don't, that's a real issue. And we see Ephesus pushing back against that. What you don't see, you really have to be, again, eisegesis. You would have to actually be inserting this sort of patriarchal authority where, Rome is Archbishop of the world, and they could just, excommunicate people will. There's actually no support of this whatsoever. There's maybe support that Ephesus would have been arguably part of the jurisdiction and patriarchate of Rome by tradition. If we go by the monoepiscopacy, that's why I started the show this way, as a tradition. If we go by where the apostles die and their relics being, the tradition that gives the elder role to wherever that location and whoever inherits the bishopric there is. But what you don't see is universal jurisdiction, right? You see arguably Pauline and Petrine jurisdiction, and you see Ephesus pushing back against that by asserting Philippine and Johnine jurisdiction over and against it. But you definitely don't see, it's just not even there. It's not in the letters, it's not mentioned, is this Petrine supremacy. It's just entirely lacking. And someone would really just have to read it with Vatican I lens. I don't mean that to offend you.
So hearing you put this extra detail into it, I think we end up actually agreeing on how we consider what was the case with this. I think it was combined doctrinal, but also a doctrinal issue dispute, but also a big clash of authority. And what your view ends up really doing, I think one of the only real differences on this specific matter, because we do disagree on matters of whether Ephesus was under Roman jurisdiction or whatever, which like, yeah, I don't think so, and all that stuff. But either way, and whether the Quartodeciman view is apostolic or not. But point being, I think what your view does in this specific aspect, it really, we agree, but you end up putting extra detail onto precisely why that is the case. So we both agree that Victor. Let me clarify. Do we both agree that Victor was putting his nose into something that he did not have a right to?
I think it actually depends upon presuppositions. As an Orthodox Christian, I'd argue he actually had a right because he had a legitimate claim that Ephesus was in Pauline, specifically Pauline. So that would have been legitimate. And it would have been legitimate that they can only have a different tradition with the consent of everyone else within that family or within that, within that jurisdiction. And so it's been very legitimate. And so I actually kind of feel, let's go by the Orthodox presuppositions for a moment.
Yeah.
What you actually would see is Rome making a legitimate claim, Rome being blessed with Peter and Paul's relics. Rome at this time would be more than half of the Christian world in their jurisdiction. People don't think of this. You don't need Roman Catholic papal supremacy to have Rome to really be the altar church over most of the world by default, because that's where Peter and Paul died. And Orthodox ecclesiology would imbue that with authority. Now, that aside, you could see why if you're under that authority, you would have at least some motivation. Then again, the nature of this authority we could debate, but you would have some motivation to at least strike out on your own a little bit and not be under that authority. And so it looks like the world's churches kind of saw a moment of weakness for Rome and used that as a way for all of them to kind of get out under the thumb or assert their authority as legitimate.
Okay.
So again, people go, well, you can't appeal outside of Rome if you're under Rome. Well, that's not true, because the Spanish bishops appealed to St. Cyprian over against Pope Stephen. If you think the argument was strictly over rebaptism, you're very, very naive. The issue is over, could you go to Carthage for an appeal and not Rome? And so this idea that, all right, I have a family dispute, you could go to mommy or daddy. Well, daddy always tells me no, so I'm going to go to mommy. So if you want to reduce this to the family example, the synodical example is very simple. Well, I could go to Carthage. Well, Rome already has a lot of authority. They have a lot of authority people near me. So I prefer to go to Carthage because that way I'm sort of less under the thumb, and Carthage may play ball with me more because, they know I can easily go to Rome against them anyway. And so it makes more sense if really imbued into kind of this interchurch politics. That's why when Orthodox here, Moscow and Constantinople's and schism with one another, and Russia starting something in Africa, we're like, oh, it's Tuesday. This is something that's so common in the politicking of Orthodoxy. We just kind of take it for granted. So that being said, I think in Victor's response, he made an assertion that he had the right, which I would argue as an Orthodox Christian he did, that you need our consent and you ought to follow the actual tradition of Peter and Paul because Paul started your church. And Polycrates' response was, no, John and Philip were here. And all these other important bishops who also venerated saints, they agree with us. And they were also distinct of, in an episcopal sense, we're talking about succession of John and Philip, and we must obey God rather than men, right? This is our authority from God. It's not Paul specifically, it's John and Philip. And so you see, Rome now kind of can't really argue against that because those relics of John are there. And so now everyone can kind of pile on Rome and kind of put the...
And he does, and that's to kind of back that up as well. He does, Polycrates, he does emphasize that John is buried here, Philip is buried here, his virgin daughters are buried here, all these other guys are buried here. So he does seem to a modern ear, kind of listening to that is like, why is that at all relevant? But then to looking at that more that kind of, if you will, Orthodox view, it actually kind of makes sense that there is a link between where an apostle is buried and like kind of the hub of their tradition, if you will.
Now let me argue for the Protestant for a second. For all we know, this controversy could have invented the importance of this relics, right? They could have just been kind of nice. And now all of a sudden, when you get into this argument, all of a sudden you start, well, yeah, these relics are here, that means something. And so you go, well, I guess it kind of does, right? Maybe no one spelled it out before then. A Protestant could say, but the point is, it is spelled out now. This is part of the controversy. And
Yeah.
so, in a sense, right, you have St. Irenaeus, who's originally from Smyrna, right?
Mhm.
But in a sense, when he lived in Rome itself for quite a few years before going then to Gaul. So he had to essentially go under Roman jurisdiction when he went to Gaul, because there's no doubt that, you know, all the people going in and out of missionaries were going to be going from Italy to France, not all the way across the Mediterranean. And so now Gaul could assert their kind of independence by putting Rome in their place. And now Alexandria could say, yes, and our synod's important, and we could give our opinion. And particularly Antioch in Jerusalem, Eusebius says, though we know from Eusebius, Jerusalem would have meant Alia at this time. They make a point of saying, because they're not Pauline churches, so they can make a point of saying, yes, and we have this view, and you know, you can't do this. So it really was a humbling of Rome, and they really wouldn't quite recover from this until the Novatian controversy, which we'll have to do another video on. I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah. So notwithstanding the many details that you give with your theory, which, well, details I hadn't entertained, but which I don't, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. I think that may actually be because as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea that Victor was asserting a Petrine universal authority is only an assumption. It may have simply been another thing I'm positive. It may have simply been that he believed that practice was in and of itself wrong, and so by virtue of that, Ephesus excommunicated itself. But then you provide the other view that that they believe that they have jurisdiction over Ephesus on account of Paul, not necessarily universal jurisdiction over the whole church, but over Ephesus because they're a Pauline church, and so therefore they're asserting that authority. To which I would say that it's a possible. To which I would say that we agree that we would agree at least in the possibility. I think we just have a paucity of evidence of whether that was Victor's actual motivation, simply because it just doesn't say that anywhere. But it does. That would well explain why he is so assertive in that with Ephesus. It's one way to explain it. Where we would disagree is whether that was actually the case, that they really did have that authority on the grounds of like apostolic ecclesiology and all that. Because I would dispute. Not necessarily because I'm against it in principle. Well, yeah, well, it's Protestant things and all that stuff. But also, if we look at the account of Irenaeus on Polycarp and Anicetus' meeting, we see this very thing being hashed out between them. And Anicetus, he's only really trying to persuade Polycarp, and at least from what Irenaeus says, he doesn't at all attempt to bring him under the authority of, oh well, we're the primate Pauline church. You gotta go with us. So if he wanted to establish unity with that, the fact that he doesn't go that route is with just asserting that authority, let alone Polycarp himself accepting that authority. It doesn't appear that Polycarp knows of such a Pauline privilege with Rome as to compel him to go with what Rome teaches on this matter. I think that kind of speaks against an idea that there was this original conception of Rome, or just generally speaking, a high primal church going over all those other churches that come under the same apostle. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's possible. I have either a Orthodox tunnel vision, or I'd even say just tunnel vision from reading 3rd, 4th, 5th century sources. So yes, they're all ancient, but the cultural context of centuries could be very different.
Yeah, so that's it.
That from the onset or offset, I forget the thing. Let me jam in 3 points really quick. One, Polycarp went to Rome, and they didn't have disagreement over Easter. Eusebius says disagreements, all right? And so here's to me, Polycarp came from Smyrna, right? Smyrna was one, maybe top 5 in Rome's biggest cities. And in so doing, he was making a point of asserting, I think, Smyrna's prerogatives. That's why.
No, sorry, I totally neglected that. Sorry, because Ephesus was the Pauline church, not Smyrna. So I guess that wouldn't really apply. Yeah.
So we have him pushing that, and maybe because Polycarp was able to get some rope here through this, it might have kind of inspired the whole family of Polycrates. Because again, family. We're talking about 8 bishops in a family to kind of use this tactic because it worked. Polycarp left Rome and it worked. So you can't make light of that. Another point I have to make is when you read ancient sources, you have to understand paper was absurdly expensive back then. They don't waste space. So even when they tell the same story twice, or they give an interpretation of slight differences, you think they're wasting space. They're doing it for a very important reason, because essentially a book back then was the price of a car today. Meaning, yes, people could afford it, but like, yeah, you could afford a car, but could you afford 10 cars? And the answer is no. So could you afford 10 books? No. How much paper could you afford? You only wrote if you had to. So they didn't waste space or write things as superfluously as people write now. It's actually one of the big reasons why I always liked reading the fathers and the scriptures. It really jam-packs information much more efficiently than what we're used to. Because, you know, we're hogs these days. We just get books up the wazoo and all sorts of wasted space. And so my point is, if Polycrates is making this quaint little suggestion about the bodies of the apostles and their daughters and stuff being there, it is not there because it's cute information. It's there because it's of incredible importance to his argument. And it's very hard for us to understand because we're so used to reading these as moderns, and we read, you know, drivel on Facebook for the heck, and we have nothing but words. It's wasted. They did not waste words when they're writing back then. I mean, you well know they recycled paper back then. They would wash the ink off and then write on top of it. And now we got X-rays to look at what used to be written there. So that detail is there very purposely. It's very important, and there's really no other rational explanation than there was a serious assertion of apostolic authority based on relics. And if Ephesus was making that point, it would be unlikely that Rome at least didn't have some sort of view, especially like Irenaeus writing about that in Book 3 against heresies at the same time. So I think that's something very important to keep in mind. I want to make one last question, and I want you to answer, which is 14ism a heresy? Right? The answer that St. Irenaeus says is no. And really, like, what we're walking away with this is no. Well, then why is this something that even Protestants would find pretty much repulsive? That we get these different dates on Easter. So, like, I really want to have a conversation about that real quick. I mean, if other Paul.
Yeah, sure.
And before that, I want to read, so people know I am reading correctly. If you look at paragraph 13 there, and then we can make our handsome faces bigger. St. Irenaeus writes to Victor, says, this variety in Easter's observance has not originated in our time, but long before in that of our ancestors. It is likely, I'm going to emphasize likely.
That's where it is, yes.
Do not hold to strict accuracy, and thus formed a custom for their posterity according to their own simplicity and peculiarity. That's where it is, yes. Right? So now we're saying, yeah, there's something aberrant here, but it's been around a while. And my argument is, yeah, there's something here, but it was exploited for an advantage. And I think what we see here is that coming into action. That'd be my overall argument. But that aside, why can't we have diversity on the issue? This is a very important point. Because really the moral of the story, if we're not going to go with the cloak and dagger stuff, is we could get along and have diversity. So why did all Christendom reject this? You know, that's kind of bizarre if you think about it.
Yeah, and to which I'll respond. I think Irenaeus kind of undercuts his own, because as he's saying here, it is likely they did not hold. He's kind of making a speculation onto the origin of this thing. But I think unwittingly, in giving his account with Anicetus and Polycarp, he undercuts his own argument by basically asserting, he's not saying that this is alleged to have happened, but that it was the case that Polycarp observed what he did with John, the disciple of the Lord. At bare minimum, that Polycarp believed that, which would basically be an airtight pedigree of that tradition.
This implies Polycarp asserted as such, but that there was reasonable grounds for doubt.
So explain that.
Meaning, Polycarp, right, is important. So you go, this is what Polycarp says, this is what it is. So you say that in one breath. But if you actually doubt the story, you have reason to doubt that Polycarp was playing this for some sort of advantage, then that would mean you could say in another breath, it's likely, you know, he made some sort of mistake in doing this, which is what he really says. So, again, we don't like saying this, we're talking about saints, but we have to accept saints will have to protect.
I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it.
You know, and their own interests they have jostled for authority and power and have used these issues. There's no doubt about that. I mean, it would make the ecumenical councils very hard to understand. It would probably, in all honesty, make probably the issue over circumcision probably tied into this. My opinion would be in Acts chapter 15, there was a large contingent in Christianity that felt that they can make serious inroads in Judaism, and they were willing to make serious compromises. But all that aside, this politicking existed from day one. And so if we just ignore this mean that everything's pristine. They wouldn't possibly have motivations to frame things a certain way. Doesn't mean they lie. But right, if like Irenaeus says, this sort of confusion was sort of there from simplicity, but then you can make good use of it, right? Like Polycarp did when he went to Rome, then there's something to it. And I think Irenaeus is very, and he's implying that there.
Yeah, I think other than what I think is some evidence against certain details of that theory, ultimately what you're doing, what you have to do is make speculation on motive, not groundless speculation like this politicking and stuff that definitely did happen, and not totally unreasonable either. But ultimately, it is a grounded thing on speculation, which I think is not really something we should prefer than to just that testimony preserved by Irenaeus and logically by Polycarp, since he knew Polycarp, that this really was something observed by Polycarp with John, and as he says, other apostles he says that he associated with, so not even just John with that. And so I think to assert a lot of politicking, taking advantage of confusion where it's not really necessary to do so, I don't think. Ironically, I think that kind of imputes the saints a little more than otherwise Orthodox would be comfortable with, in my opinion, because, well, yeah, I think it is quite simpler just to say, look, they're making a historical witness from, well, supposedly 2 apostles, but likely just 1. But let's just say that, plus Philip the Evangelist, and then bunches of other people who followed it and all that. That ultimately Irenaeus, he's kind of really forced himself to say this, because in the end he does prefer the other position. So he's kind of forced to say maybe they just, I don't know, it's coming out of a confusion, whatever. So an innocent speculation on his part, but which is ultimately undercut.
That's a speculation on your behalf. When we deal with these rudimentary sources, we are making speculations all the time, and we just have to be critical of, am I just making the traditional speculation, or is there another speculation that fits this better? Because at the end of the day, you have we just read the whole thing. And just so people know, because I would consider myself a pious Orthodox Christian, this is me wearing the historian hat, not the Orthodox hat. I could just accept strictly Irenaeus at his word, and that doesn't change anything. But if you really want to understand this in a historically critical way, I think the argument I laid out here, no one listening to this will ever read these words the same ever again. You can't, because it makes too much sense, in all honesty.
It makes too much sense if you grant the whatchamacallit.
If you grant the 2nd century church operated like the 1st century church and operated like the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. So unless the 2nd century is somehow different than every other century, then yeah.
Well, here's the thing. I don't even have to deny that there was politicking. I made that quite clear. There is politicking. I just think it's strictly speaking coming from the end of Victor. I don't think we have to assume motives of politicking from Polycarp, from Asia Minor, and basically almost every other bishop involved in the controversy apart from Victor, because our views are fundamentally this. Victor's asserting a correct claim on Ephesus, and all the other bishops around the world are taking advantage of confusions and politicking in a somewhat disingenuous way to kind of get away from his sphere of influence. Whereas my view is simply that the church is doing its own thing, not perfectly, obviously not in a pristine state, but they're ultimately doing their own thing. They kind of have this widespread agreement of regional autonomy, doing their own practices and all, as Irenaeus lets known, and Polycrates forcefully does. But then Victor decides to step out of line in trying to step into his business into Ephesus, because I believe that makes much more sense of that evidence. And as you say, yes, it's correct. We all make speculations on history, but I believe that's a much better evidence speculation, because what else? Because otherwise you're asking us to posit that Victor alone knew that he had a rightful authority over Ephesus, and the rest of the church either did not recognize it or borderline lied about recognizing that authority.
Well, it would have been questionable, actually, because right, if let's just say, let's grant, whether it's from honor or some sort of charism, that where the apostles' relics are imbues a sort of authority, right? And so we know Paul's in Rome, and we know then, all right, and that authority transmits itself in connection to wherever that apostle started a church. Whether it's because when Paul died, right, Timothy was in Rome, according to Hebrews, right? So, like, right, people connected to these apostles were actually left where they died. So we know that historically speaking. But I would say, what do you do with a situation like Ephesus? The apostles might have not left direction. What do you do if, all right, they're connected to Paul, but now they're also connected to John, right? Like, yes, after Clement's death, there would have been other bishops of Rome, but John was still alive, right? So, like, who's going to have more authority, the fifth bishop of Rome or the actual Apostle John who knew Jesus? Who are you going to listen to if you live in Ephesus? Come on, let's use her. Even a Roman Catholic, I think, if the Apostle John.
Why?
I'm saying
Sure.
the Apostle John is sitting right here in this chair, and then I'm getting a phone call from Pope Francis. Who am I going to listen to? Pope Francis or the Apostle John right here? I mean, so the point is, so even with all those papal presuppositions, people would have had a very strong reason, just like to go, well, no, John means something. John knew Christ. John's the virgin apostle. And so what do you do now, decades after John's death, at least traditionally speaking?
Yeah.
People are trying to figure out, yes, we need consent of here or there because of the relics being here and the church being began by this apostle. Well, who's Ephesus under, right? They might not know. Is it Pauline? Is it John? Or are they their own thing? And what we actually see unfold is Ephesus saying, well, no, we're our own thing. And they've had every reason to want that. Not only because, yes, John's relics were there, but two, who wants to be under someone else's thumb? And that's all church history, is people not wanting to be under other people's thumbs. So
yeah,
we're thinking about.
yeah, and that gets into territory of where we agree. With who would you, even with the papal presuppositions, who would you listen to, the fifth pope or the bloody apostle himself? And I guess so that would really highlight where our disagreement is we both agree that Victor, whether he claimed it or not, I think we kind of both lean towards him not actually claiming a universal Petrine authority, but we both agree that that they didn't have that degree of authority. But then the question is, how much did he actually have? And so where we're kind of going at each other's throats is you're claiming Victor claimed this authority. He really did have that authority, but the rest of the church is like, yeah, now we're kind of separating it. Whereas I'm saying Victor may have claimed that kind of authority. He might have claimed that type of Pauline relic-based authority, or he might have simply tried to ice out Ephesus on the grounds of, look, what they're saying is just ipso facto wrong. And then the rest of the church just simply responds with what appears to be a universal sense, apart from Victor, of, hey, just let the locals do their own thing as long as it's within the Orthodox Christian milieu. So that'd be an interesting thing to kind of continue discussion on at some point.
Well, let me just say this, because I really want to get into this, like, because there's moral implication to this, and whether 14ism is a heresy. But what if, like St. Irenaeus says, the start of the Apostle John, but he was the confused one? Or, well, like, people can't get confused. I mean, like, come on, But anyway,
you're getting onto thin ice there with your. I don't in principle discount that kind of a thing. I get kind of uncomfortable with it when it's talking about something that appears to be a pretty core practice of the church. But I think your fellow ortho bros might get uncomfortable with what you're saying here.
We're not talking about the apostle. Like, one, we know the apostles can make mistakes because their mistakes are actually recorded. So I don't think that impious by saying he can make a mistake. Two, we're not talking about him teaching doctrine. We're talking about which day of the week. It also is possible that for consideration specific to Ephesus itself, whether it be Jews or pagans, he might have actually changed the day, just like Orthodox know that Pascha was changed to Saturday in Greece over the COVID stuff. And so you can't be like, oh, that's impossible. That can never happen, but that just did. Or that's impossible. You can't have different days. Well, Finland, the Finnish Orthodox Church, has a different day for Pascha. And so we don't know if the Apostle John, there's persecutions or whatever, could have, for a practical, real reason and not a selfish political reason, could have said, you know what, we should do it on this day, and it still works according to another calendar, because the Jews had multiple calendars. So he could have done it as
That's
well.
Some extra speculation there.
I'm just saying, all we know is that Paul, according to most of the church, and Peter did it one way, John knew those guys, so it's kind of bizarre that he would not known they did it that way. But allegedly,
I think it's only, I think the issue only really comes up if we assume that the apostles, let alone the very earliest of the church, well, maybe some of them did, like with Ananias and Polycarp, but if we assume that there is a contradiction between one set of church celebrating it one way and others celebrating on a different day, as of course as a pro, I just simply say, why couldn't have different apostles chose to celebrate the death and resurrection of the Lord on different days for distinct but both all theologically significant reasons? Well, like why not? I don't think there's an issue.
Well, that's exactly St. Irenaeus' argument, right? So you can't say it's impossible, but St. Irenaeus literally states. The point is, what prevents an apostle from saying, we're going to do it this day now? Maybe all was on Sunday, and then John changed it there. To explain a lot why it's aberrant. It's aberrant as in different than everyone else's, but people really stuck to their guns, like St. Melito of Sardis and stuff, in the Aegean and Asian Minor. In the end, we don't know. But the point is, if we go strictly on what's said, using that as the gold standard, Irenaeus says there's some sort of likely confusion, whatever, and Polycarp maybe. And Polycarp got it from John. That's all we know. So if you put those two things together, I'd ask you, audience, well, then, if we're going to accept those in face value, what does that mean? And then you're going to find what I've said maybe not be the case, but it's also not crazy either.
No, it's definitely not crazy. No, your view is definitely, well, I'd say in a loose sense within the realm of possibility, because as I said, I brought up, I appeal to some things which kind of put in some elements of that view into question, but definitely not crazy. Definitely not papist crazy.
Well, it's just sadly for, again, Roman Catholics, like you want to kind of give a hearing for their view to this. It's just entirely lacking from the sources where you can't even, I'm sure people are going to cut up this video and go, look at Craig making crazy speculations when I'm just having fun with history. I think I'm doing right now, not legitimate theology, but legitimate history. But the thing is, I'm actually saying stuff that you could at least infer from the source. What you can't infer is universal supremacy.
Because I think before you continue, I think this may be a good hard transition point to now we've kind of looked at the evidence itself, what it looks like, how it portrays the ecclesiology of the early church. Then we kind of went on to a back and forth between your theory versus my kind of not as much theory, but just kind of, look, I'm just going by what it says here. And you're willing to go deeper into what could have been the case, as well as a kind of a clash between my presuppositions versus your Orthodox presuppositions. But now I think we can kind of think of a hard transition into implications for Roman ecclesiology, which we've commented a bit on already, but now I guess we can kind of make it official. It is officially the case now. We're going to talk about implications for Roman ecclesiology.
Well,
I'll let you have the start.
To make the Roman case is very simple. Pope St. Victor asked for something. He would only ask for something if he could get it. He asked for something that wasn't in Rome. Therefore, he must have thought he could ask for something anywhere. That's their argument. Now, I don't think I was very colorful with that argument, but I think anyone hearing that would go, that doesn't really sound like the evidence could be explained that whatsoever, right? Like, it doesn't abide by how we understand synods. It doesn't abide by
to steelman the argument, to steelman the argument a little bit, to basically add the detail to it. It would be that Rome has said one thing, all the other churches agree with them, and one church is disagreeing, and Victor is stepping into that other section of the church and demanding they accept it. And because they're refusing to, he's issuing letters of excommunication abroad. Thus, this demonstrates that Rome has a universal jurisdiction over the whole church and is able to declare a whole section of the church excommunicate on the grounds of a difference in practice, really, which would arguably put an even greater authority. But that's the steelman, to kind of steelman the Roman argument a bit more.
All right, and well put. The issue, let's agree that is an argument someone can make. We'll have to also agree that Eusebius disagrees with this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Not because he says this is what they're doing and I don't think they could have. Rather, he almost dismisses, like, as in it's like a ridiculous thing. Like, how could this even happen? It's so ridiculous. That's how he dismisses it. So it's like I said, it's a really peculiar proof text, like I said before, but also just the responses of the world's churches really don't lend itself to that. It would be unthinkable if there was a understood Vatican I papacy that Irenaeus would rebuke Pope Saint Victor worldwide over this, over something he can't do. So maybe I think the Roman Catholic could say, well, he didn't say you're not able to excommunicate people, but even that carries a lot of presuppositions. Technically, you could be like Diotrephes in 3 John. You could just close yourself off from people. No one stops you. It's not right, and people could rebuke you for doing that, like John rebuked Diotrephes, right? So it's Rome very well, like in very well could have said, we're not going to have anything to do with people doing this thing that's wrong. And we can see it as that, but just the difference between that and supremacy is so broad. It's just not there.
I mean, I would think it would be a bit more than, well, it would definitely be more than just Rome wanting to keep themselves off from others. It's less of a case of Rome wanting to isolate themselves from a certain group and more wanting to isolate that group from everybody else, since, he sends the letters all across the world saying, these guys are excommunicated, these guys are gone. And you would, of course, have the response, as we mentioned before, that, well, okay, all the other bishops disagree with Rome's decision, but they didn't say that Rome didn't have the authority to do that. And I believe, how would you respond to that? I believe your answer would definitely be more nuanced, because you do believe Rome had some kind of authority to step in, but not to a papist claim. How would you respond to that argument?
There's an interesting detail in St. Irenaeus' letter, which is that they sent the Eucharist, right? So like when we think of intercommunion, usually Roman Catholics and Orthodox mean concelebration, that everyone's going behind the altar and communing when they're there. But there's this other earlier practice where essentially they mailed you the Eucharist, right? And this showed some sort of communion. What we don't have evidence of, like, well, does that mean if Rome's going to mail me the Eucharist, that Alexandria is going to mail me the Eucharist, and that Alia is going to email me it's going to mail me the Eucharist, and Antioch's going to mail me the Eucharist, and in Gaul, and on and go. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think perhaps to send the Eucharist from Rome to Smyrna was some sort of way of saying you're part of our family, and that's how
I'm thinking as well. Yeah.
That's how we show we're still a part of the family. So by Smyrna accepting it, and if Ephesus would accept it, in some ways it's a tip of the cap to, yes, Rome, you're the elder within the familial arrangement.
Yeah.
Rome giving it also meant toleration of their differences. So you can see the disagreements, to quote Eusebius, Irenaeus, that Polycarp had with I forget the name of the Pope at the time, Ancetus or something. I might be reading the wrong. I've been reading a lot of history today, so I might have the wrong name. But the Pope that Polycarp met with.
Yeah, that's Ancetus.
Presuming the title Pope existed in the 2nd century, but the Bishop of Rome. In a sense, they both gave up something in a way, right? By receiving the Eucharist being mailed to you, maybe that implied that I am still part of this. I'm not totally independent. Now, again, thinking these terms kind of bizarre. We're all one family in Christ. Doesn't matter who the apostle is, right? It's like, I guess they're all different uncles per se, and this one guy's the dad, and you're all part of that family. But the point is, it's maybe logistically lend itself that way, because he couldn't possibly, every church in the world just be sending Eucharist all over the place. I just haven't read that. So it's an interesting detail where we just don't have enough, we just don't know enough. Now, this is definitively the importance of that detail, but it lends credibility to that there was some jostling going on, and there was some significance to this, right? Again, they don't waste paper. So there's some significance. They sent the Eucharist. It wasn't just that they concelebrated in Rome. They sent the Eucharist back to Smyrna. And so I think they may imply, like I said, from the Orthodox vantage point, local jurisdiction. And so that'd be the response to the Roman Catholic. What we see here is entirely consistent with patriarchal jurisdiction or proto-patriarchal jurisdiction. But there's just no indication, right? Like I could see patriarchal authority. That's very clear, or at least able to be inferred. Supremacy you don't see, because it would make more sense if this was Jerusalem or something like that, right? There could be no confusion that it's Petrine or whatever, and we just don't have that in this example. So I think that'd be my very nuanced response.
Yeah, very nuanced, bro, response indeed. And with my response, I'd simply reply to that for one, it's a very misleading argument to say, well, they disputed, but they didn't dispute his authority, because for one, Eusebius gives a very minor gloss of what the majority of bishops said, and he only directly quotes 2 letters from 2 of those bishops, and only partially at that. And one of them actually does, in my opinion, dispute deny that authority of Rome over Asia Minor in this matter, where we look at the end of Polycrates' letter. He's done all the name dropping of all the different people who observed the practice. So we have allegedly two apostles, Philip and John, the daughters of Philip, Polycarp, Melito, Papirius, and all these others. It's basically a big name dropping session. And at the very end, he refers to himself in writing, I, therefore, brethren, who have lived 65 years in the Lord and have met with the brethren throughout the world and have gone through every holy scripture, am not affrighted by terrifying words. For those greater than I have said we ought to obey God rather than man. Which, at bare minimum, if Polycrates was considered to be under the authority of the Bishop of Rome on account of Rome being the place where Paul was martyred, where his relics are and all that, so local authority, but then, of course, by extension, Petrine authority as well. If that actually was the case, this is a very bizarre, very irreverent, and borderline schismatic statement by Polycrates on behalf of Asia Minor, if that was actually the case, in my opinion, because he's saying he's putting in a dichotomy between the words of God, the words of men, and not really giving that category of the words and the commands of your superiors. And so he's relegating Victor's threats to that of a mere man, which on its own, like regardless of what our presuppositions on the state of authority is, that's a massive insult. And I think with respect to the Roman paradigm, makes absolutely. I think it's problematic on the Orthodox paradigm, that Victor really did have that authority, and yet Polycrates would give such an insult like this. I think it's a bit problematic, but it's definitely a scandal, in my opinion, for Polycrates to be saying to the alleged vicar of Christ, because now he's saying that Victor is but a man, not God, even though the view should be that Victor is the vicar of Christ. That is the height of an insult right there. So from that, I believe that, yes, we do have a quoted source, one of 2 quoted sources from Eusebius denying Victor's authority to do what he's doing, to be making his threats.
Well, it wouldn't be outside the possibility for a heretic or a horrible schismatic to do such a thing. But
on behalf of an entire region, though, that's pretty big.
Victor's rebuked. Rome's rebuked. The world's churches disagree with Ephesus, and then after this letter, go to Ephesus' support. So what you see is the view that's actually heralded is in this opposition to Rome. And so, like I said, it's a very bizarre proof text, because, right, he's saying we have to do this because this is what the Apostle John taught us, and that comes from God, right? Wasn't Peter and John the ones who said in unison, we must obey God rather than men? They're the 2 that were arrested in chapter 5. And so whichever passage that's being quoted, and instead of saying the world churches condemned Ephesus for rejecting the Pope and rejecting the right day of Easter, instead, even though they disagreed with them on Easter, they actually came to their support on this issue. So it shows that this vicar of Christ papal supremacy view, if you could even infer that it existed then and that Pope Victor was actually asserting it, was rejected, right? Yeah. He was rebuked. So that's why I say it's just bizarre and peculiar. I don't know how else to explain it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Totally, very scandalous statement from Polycrates. Let's speculate in the modern day. If a very similar scenario, so a matter of discipline on church liturgy, so this would be a liturgical matter. So let's say that Rome, because this would technically, on a Roman paradigm, be an exercise of the ordinary universal magisterium, would it not? Because we got the Bishop of Rome saying something, and then all the bishops around the world agreeing with it. Would you Would you agree that this, in a Roman paradigm, would be an ordinary universal magisterium matter?
I don't know. I'm not Roman Catholic.
Well, I think well, surely you'd understand it a little bit, but I think with my, I'm not a canon lawyer or an expert on Roman ecclesiology by any means, but I know enough to say that I believe that what would happen here, Romanists would point this to as an example of a kind of a combined exercise of the ordinary universal magisterium and then the Pope enforcing that on another church. And so, in a modern day scenario, if this issue was happening today, then it would be very clear cut that this region, Polycrates and Asia Minor, would effectively be the equivalent of Germany right now, because with what Germany, the German churches in the Catholic Church, effectively what they're doing, like apart from their straight up heresies on same-sex marriage and that, their liturgical abuses on things like open Eucharist, for example, that's something which, if we had this equivalent issue happening today, the ordinary universal magisterium of the bishops throughout the world, plus the Pope, all condemning, all saying that this thing is wrong, in this same scenario, this would definitely very clearly, Asia Minor would very clearly be schismatic in this matter, in denying its, in denying the authority of the Pope and the ordinary universal magisterium on this matter. And so, if Polycrates was doing this today, he would 100% be condemned. He'd be on his way to a defrocking, potentially even an excommunication, depending on how far he'd take it. That's what I think would happen. Polycrates could not be a faithful Roman Catholic today.
Well, no, absolutely not. There could be no doubt about that.
Yeah. So to say that this authority system is really apostolic and goes back to the beginning, well, then you're going to have to say that Polycrates was a schismatic, was scandalous, and yet the majority of the church supported him and the cause of Asia Minor. So what are we having here? Like it's almost as if Rome, because like you'll see the Roman apologists,
not the Eastern cause, right? They were against that.
The Asia Minor cause.
Yep.
So you'd have to posit that, how would I say it? You'd have to, because like the Roman apologists, especially Joe, I've been reading a lot of Joe Heschmeyer, particularly his recent The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, because I have a bit of a review series of that coming up. And they like to really lay waste to the lay Protestant idea of the great apostasy at the beginning and all that. Like, oh, that's a ridiculous idea. The great apostasy. You're saying Christ failed the church. That couldn't have happened. Therefore, Catholic Church true. But functionally, in my opinion, I think they have to posit something of a quasi-great apostasy for everyone other than Rome, because now you have everyone here. You have everyone here supporting a very schismatic church here, denying the authority of the ordinary universal magisterium and that of the Pope of Rome. I think this would amount to the functional early great apostasy on the Roman paradigm. What would you say about that? I saw you nodding your head a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you actually look at the primary sources for the rebaptism controversy, it's the same issue. The world's churches rebuke Rome. The Fifth Ecumenical Council, world churches rebuke Rome. There's only the only response you ever hear is that Rome just condescends to every weakness for so long until they just refuse to it years later. And it's like you said, yeah, it does kind of seem like is a reason why both you Protestants and Roman Catholics are schismatics, because you both believe in this great apostasy. I as an Orthodox Christian, can feel very comfortable with these historical events. They all make sense in my ecclesiology.
I'm more nuanced than the great apostasy view. Maybe I'll explain that in the video one day.
I just want to needle you a little bit. Let me make one comment before we do audience questions, which would be...
Oh, excuse me. Oh, yeah, audience questions. Yes, by your authority. Yes, please. We'll get onto that.
Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia. I think it's sad that in the early church, we were able to have this diversity on practice. Doesn't mean that none exists today in Orthodox. Like I said, we have 2 dates for Pascha, though I think that's horrible. But this diversity of practice became canonically against the rules after the Council of Nicaea. And if you're Orthodox, you must affirm like that's a good thing on some level. And I think people have to critically look at the church before it became the imperial church was different. Doesn't mean that different dogmas. I'm not arguing that. Doesn't mean it wasn't liturgical. I'm not arguing, because man, I'm a faithful Orthodox Christian. But the way they did things was streamlined so it could work within the imperial context with greater numbers. And so with the divisiveness in the Roman Empire, they had to standardize things. And that includes the liturgies. The liturgies were different all over the place. And then when you had somewhere new like Constantinople, you no longer had the liturgy like you read about in St. Hippolytus' Apostolic tradition, where everyone sits down for a meal and the bishop teaches in the middle of this liturgy. A familial meal where everyone's together. It's actually kind of sad we don't have that anymore.
Mad idea, preaching while everyone's eating. That's actually mad. I might do that when I start a church one day.
Well, okay. I mean, well, yeah. So anyway, God bless you, Paul. So that being said, you have this very familial context where the church began, and what you have is in the beginning, the people that were put the spoon in the mouth were children, right? Because they couldn't hold the body of Christ right, or they're so small they don't even eat their hands yet. Like I still feed my son with a spoon sometimes. He's a toddler. And we go where, all right, centuries later, everyone receives in a very regimented fashion, whether liturgy St. John Chrysostom, liturgy St. Basil, which is local liturgies kind of standardized. Right? They weren't exclusive, by the way. There was still liturgical diversity up into the 14th century. It's pretty much until the Turks where all that dissipates. But that being said, you have this very familial liturgy and way of worshiping, and it gives way to, by the 10th century, we're just jamming spoons to the Eucharist people's mouths because you can't trust them to really be faithful Christians and treat the sacrament with respect. Now it's actually a badge of honor. I want the spoon. Or if you're Roman Catholic, I want the Eucharist received on my tongue and on my hand. Like it's almost being the toddler is now this mark of honor that's more traditional, but that's not the original way of doing things. We've become spiritual infants is my point. And so I think what the Eastern morally teaches us is that there was a time in the church where if you were in the military, you couldn't commune. If you were divorced, you couldn't commune. If all these things, it was being a community member of the church were people that were repentant and faithful to Christ, willing to die for the faith. Seriously die for faith. Not they were born in, and it's a sort of cool thing to do on Sunday. It meant something. And when you have that level of seriousness, you can have this liturgical diversity, and it can be done in a respectful, loving manner, and you could keep it going. And what we've lost is that seriousness in Christian love. And so really, we almost need the standardization, because without that, it all fall apart. As an Orthodox Christian, I feel we'd have confusion. It would become fractured like Protestantism. We don't have a pope, so we don't have enforced liturgical conformity. It's almost like the spirit in our church has made it where this conformity holds us together at this point, because we have nothing forcing it other than just everyone agreeing to the custom. It doesn't have to be that way is my point. But it says a lot about us that it has become that way. And that gives us reason to repent, to look for Christ. And it's not impossible, though it's probably going to come from persecution, where we can always return to the way the things they were when it comes liturgically speaking and all these things. We could have that, but it's going to require much stronger faith than we have today.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, because obviously, you know me, I'm all for that liturgical diversity, and I do believe that is ultimately what makes us a strength, and that's really the point of Irenaeus, I think, in that very letter, in that part where it's almost like it's pretty much a unity through diversity kind of point, if you will, which I think is really the key of it. I believe, and it's definitely the prop me talking here, that once the focus ended up shifting, once it became kind of comfortable, if you will, and the focus shifted towards enforcing a diversity on liturgical matters, which strictly speaking do not change the actual content of our faith. Once the focus came to that and standardizing, I think that's where the weakness really ended up beginning, because as soon as you have a little bit of diversity, the whole edifice just ends up cracking, like with the whole issue with the novice ordo versus the Tridentine Mass, for example. Like you can even think in a Roman Catholic and even in other non-Roman Catholic perspectives that there are uses of the novice order which are legitimately quite bad. But the fact that this is such a fractious issue in the church today, when if the Catholic Church, for example, simply tolerated the idea, if it did have that spirit of tolerance for distinct liturgical practices, so long as they actually revere the Lord, the novice order issue wouldn't be anywhere near as disastrous as it would be today. And I don't know as much as liturgical issues in the Orthodox Church, although I think it might also likewise make the whole old versus new calendar issue a bit less, shall we say, destructive than what it is today. But with that,
the quote from Irenaeus on that note, yet all these lived nonetheless in peace, and we also live in peace with one another, and the disagreement in regard to the fast confirms the agreement in the faith. The disagreement confirms agreement.
Right there, highlighted on the screen.
Right there. We live by that, but right now we can't. We would need to up our spiritual game.
Well, yeah, that's it. You can't. I as a nice faithful prod, I can affirm this wholeheartedly and practice it.
I'm being nice. Don't maybe give the Dr. Gavin Ortland answer.
That's it. I might get him on this or something one day. But now that we've done this, we've just passed the 2-hour mark. So 2 hours of fantastic discussion with Craig here. Really awesome stuff. Lots of good meat that I think we'll be able to get through, because this is some high level. It's always with me and Craig. We're always getting into the high level discussion and debating on issues where we like to move the conversation forward beyond the usual talking points. So something like, for example, Craig kind of explicating his own theory here, adding to the discussion on it is super, super valuable stuff. This is some very exclusive content you guys are getting here. But now we can finally get to Q&A. So to start with, question: what is the Orthodox Church's perspective on the Quartodeciman Controversy compared to other controversies? I'm going to assume he means Orthodox.
I would say, in short, it's seen as something bad because, canonically speaking, we don't want to keep Passover the Jews. Well, then, I think it's more racially tinged now than would have been then, because was that what I thought it was? So
it
anyway,
is exactly, and it's authentic. My mum got it on a mission trip from Israel, so it's authentic. It is blessed.
So that's my authentic Jewish mother visiting tomorrow. So anyway, it's we see it as bad because there's a reason why we don't do the Jewish works of the law, right? Because they were tutors to bring us to Christ. Now that we have Christ, we don't go back to the old things. And so when we kind of confuse Judaism with Christianity, it actually takes our eyes off Christ, would be the Orthodox view. So we see this canon as something very good. So perhaps I speculated, this really did begin in St. John, maybe this other confusion or whatever. I gave some theories on this. But even then, I don't think I'd be comfortable saying that's really originally the way it was, because we would see, like with St. Paul, where we don't keep the new moon, the new moons and the Sabbaths and all this stuff. All this stuff takes us away from Christ. So that would be the Orthodox view.
Okay. AJ asks, I guess this is almost a meta question. I'll bring us back here. I guess this is almost a meta question, but if the apostles knew what the correct interpretation was, why didn't they pass this teaching down to the early Christians? I'll take this one first and say, basically highlighting what I said before, that if it was the case that Paul and Peter, they observed Christ's death and resurrection on one time, John did on the other, and if they knew that they observed each other's, if assuming they knew that they observed on different times, I would personally say that it just wasn't a matter, it just wasn't a right or wrong matter. They simply chose, look, I'm going to celebrate in this way at this time, based on this kind of theological perspective. So with John being the more quote unquote Jewish, or I'd more say Israelite, because I like to distinguish between Jewish, Hebrew, and Israelite versus Jewish. I like to consider Jewish the false religion of the Second Temple and rabbinic periods.
Number one. Khazar's number one. Khazars.
Say it again. Khazar's number one. Oh boy, we're gonna get some comments with that. But so I'd say that so there's a theological perspective in John's tradition that's more oriented with respect to the nation of Israel, the Passover, and all that stuff. Whereas the Pauline and the PATRON perspective is much more oriented towards the resurrection and all that. So I'd say that, at least in my perspective, I would posit that they didn't consider it a right or wrong thing. They just celebrated the same thing, and both of those means of celebrating were very legitimate, and they respected those differences. So I would say that it's not really a starter, this kind of question. Although, of course, Craig would have a different answer. So what would you say to this?
The Orthodox obviously believe the apostles did leave correct interpretation, and it would be sacred tradition, and the sacred tradition has prevailed to be the Sunday observance. But this speaks to the difference in understanding tradition, which Paul and I will be debating in June or something. So we will get into that.
Isn't it May 2nd or May 7th?
I don't know. You just remind me.
I've got to contact Marlon again. He hasn't gotten back to me yet, so I'll get on that.
So that being said, it's the main thing is it's not without tension, right? So whether Paul's going to bring this up or bring up, Saint Irenaeus saying was 50 or whatever, it's not like we have evidence that all right, the sacred tradition and everyone right off the bat agreed 100% on what it was. Obviously that's not the case. That's two examples now already in the 2nd century. But I'm going to make the argument that's not as big a deal as we think. Like even here, there's a majority opinion, right? So it's not like, oh no, the whole world's coming apart. But then again, maybe I'm not one of those epistemic certainty people where I need something absolutely unequivocal for to feel. I don't
know. Oh man, the epistemic certainty people. That's some fun stuff right there. Hopefully more questions are coming in, kind of scrolling down. Okay. Dr. Bob, question for Craig. Does it really matter when Easter is celebrated? Let me flesh it out. If we perchance discovered when Easter Sunday actually was, could that change the tradition? Our solar calendars today are more accurate, and we know when Passover was both in 30 and 33 AD, which seem to be the most probable years. So what would you say about that?
I would say more importantly, could a calendar change in how you calculate? The answer is yes. It could be lunar, it could be solar, it could have certain fractions of the year or whatever. So that could change. But Sunday can't, right? Sunday is the day Christ resurrected. And so for the reason I already stated, we don't want to be what St. Paul warned about, doing the new moon festivals and Sabbaths. We want to have Christian traditions. We want to have Christian observances. We want to be conforming ourselves to Christ. And so I would argue that it does matter that it's on Sunday for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Cool answer. What is an orthochog? I think we explained that towards the beginning. It is Craig's brand new church that he actually started right in the middle of our debate, or towards the end of our debate. It's actually quite great. I actually personally lean myself towards the sacred tradition of the Orthochog Church. Oh man, I thought the Quartodecimans were largely in decline by the 4th century anyway. They were, though they still existed, and they were persecuted by Nestorius and Chrysostom. So there's that. And so I'm kind of going into non-questions as well, because there's just barely any questions. Like, people are apparently really uninspired today. Might be jumping into content. Oh. Say it again, you went mute.
Guest.
I know, right? I think it's just your video quality. People might just be getting headaches from it. I might just be jumping into convo sans context. I'd say Irenaeus is very trustworthy. Yep, I'd agree with you. Not infallible, definitely not infallible, but trustworthy. The Quartodeciman Controversy was a natural outgrowth of the change of the Jewish calendar that occurred only 2 decades before Christ. Very interesting. I'd like to look at that.
I have some comments on that.
Yes.
The Essenes had a different calendar than the let's say the Sadducees had, which would have been regular calendar. And it actually comes up because it changes. Passover was, Thursday night for the Essenes, and it was Friday night for everyone else. And it's interesting, and I tend to think that it's because Christ is the Savior for all men, right? So in a sense, he did fulfillments on these different days. Instead of saying the apostles were disagreeing with each other, there were calendar differences. But we wouldn't have even known this stuff until Qumran. We didn't have these documents from the Essenes to even make sense of it. So I do think a lot of this could have been, right, like what St. Irenaeus was referring to, confusion and simplicity. Like, what if it was Sunday on one calendar, but then everyone thought it was Saturday, and then it just ran away with itself? Who knows?
That is definitely a very interesting way of looking at it. Kind of ties back to the church taking back the temple. Yeah. Do we have other instances for such to anachronize antinomian rhetoric to anachronize, antinomian rhetoric in the pre-imperial church? Do you understand that question, or
here's my wild guess, which is
your sacred interpretation?
the pre-imperial church of maybe this sort of conciliar jostling. I don't know. Guess, right? Like, it's not like you got a canon from Constantinople says this is how it is. Yeah, like we said, you almost need a whole other episode of the rebaptism controversy, or even Paul Samosata. We do have examples of this.
I think what the question's asking is maybe the rhetoric on, we want to do things different from the Jews. So I think that maybe that's kind of how I mean antinomian. So antinomian against the law and all that. So not wanting to observe the works of the law and that.
I mean, St. Ignatius is specific about that. St. Ignatius says not to keep the Sabbath, the Jews. We see in the Didache, not to fast like the hypocrites, which is the Jews. So yeah, no, we definitely have that.
Or maybe it wasn't that, because then he also says people going God over men.
Yes, that as well. The baptism controversy. St. Cyprian said that each bishop must give account to God, and not them. And interestingly, St. Dionysius Alexander says the same exact thing. He almost certainly was quoting Carthage's council.
Yep. Cool. There you go. And that's pretty much everything for now. That's the Q&A. Craig, would you like to give your plugs?
I mean, do I have to? I mean, people know where there's a link there if you want to go get it. In the end of the day, learning church history should be a means of getting closer to God, whether it's your filling time that you do more trivial things with at least something that's somewhat Christian oriented, and so you can contextualize your scripture reading. It's so important that we're doing this not as a vain form of amusement. We really have to be getting closer to God. And so I just find that important because that's why I wanted to end this with a moral thing. I see this and I say, yes, we get these historical things, but it's also very humbling. They got through this despite the political jostling, being a very faithful church, very rigoristic, and we're spiritual infants today. So like, my plug would be, if this has blessed you, use this as an opportunity to really take seriously the faith, like the people that were writing this and disputing this issue. We live such a trivial life where, we're worried about feeding our fat face and we're not fasting, even though the scriptures are explicit about it. We barely pray. We barely read the scriptures. Are we spending time with God, right? Are we praying and reading the scriptures? Are we really just kind of settling and letting that time be with God? And I think if we were, we'd have a lot less issues, and also God would give us wisdom and more faith. And I just think that's what we need to use. That's what I want my plug to be about, is to use this as an opportunity to look at history as a means to draw close to God in prayer and scripture reading.
Absolutely. Big time amen to that, because I've always said for a very long time, I even did it in a devotional with a history class I was teaching, that the Christian faith is a faith of history. So it's not like the vast majority of religions around the world based on esoteric legends and purely symbolic teachings and the babblings of gurus who kind of just thought for a long time under a tree. But it is based on real events that happen in real history that we can pinpoint, and which emphasizes that this is really the faith that accounts for reality. It is not something totally other from us. There is a totally other aspect to it, but it is ultimately something that is rooted in real human reality. And so the more we understand the contours of history, the more we can understand how God is working throughout history. Because in the end, it is all everything that happens is something that he himself has foreknown, he himself has decreed. There is an entire pattern throughout all of history. And the better we understand that, the better we can understand the activities of God, especially in light of the paradigm given in his holy word. And so to give my my more material plugs, if you're not subscribed already, please subscribe here. Follow me on my other pages like Facebook and alternatives like Gab, especially Gab, should I get nuked from here one day. And if you wish to support my ministry, you believe in what I'm doing, and you want to get some nice little benefits, you can become a patron, link below. or give a one-time donation. And I'm eventually wanting to get some merch out very soon, so that's gonna be fun too. Very relevant stuff for you to profess your faith in a kind of memey way. Yes, also join the Discord server. Join both our Discord servers. So we have your Discord server, Apostolic, Charitable Apostolic Discussion.
I think so.
There's something like that. You can find. I didn't put the link here, but you can find it in the link in Craig's videos. You can join that server. Very, very good. Particularly if you're an Orthodox, Roman Catholic, stuff like that, because it's primarily meant for them. Although there are us token prots in there. But also join my Discord in particular, the Theocrat Lounge, for any and all Christians who are not, in the broad sense, heretical. Although if you're a heretical Christian or if you're a heathen, you may be able to get in at special permission from me. Either way, very good server, very good community. And as a final encouragement, to quote from the words of Ben Sirach, fight to death for the truth and the Lord God will fight for you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been the other Paul. This has been Craig. I hope you have a great day, great evening. God bless.